Welcome to Chosen by Love, where fate brings hearts together in the most unexpected ways. Subscribe and join our growing family of story lovers. Tell us where you're watching from, and let's begin today's journey. Sometimes the most important person in your life begins as the one you were never supposed to answer. The old cream-colored telephone rang once, then twice, then a third time, its soft chime echoing through the tiny kitchen of a weathered bungalow on the quiet edge of Portland, Oregon. Tessa Whitmore looked up from the stack of unpaid bills spread across the scarred wooden table and closed her eyes for a brief second. Almost nobody called that number anymore. Most people texted. Everyone else had forgotten the landline years ago. Everyone except telemarketers and the occasional wrong number. She rubbed the bridge of her nose and glanced toward the clock above the refrigerator. It was 11:46 p.m. Her 12-hour shift at the customer support center had ended less than 20 minutes earlier, and exhaustion clung to her shoulders like a heavy winter coat. She considered letting the machine pick up, but something about the persistence of the ringing tugged at her chest. Her mother used to say, "Don't let a lonely heart listen to too many unanswered rings." Even after 3 years, that sentence still lived somewhere inside her. Tessa reached for the receiver and pressed it gently against her ear. "Hello." For a few seconds there was only breathing. Slow, uneven, almost hesitant. Then a man's voice, low and calm, drifted through the line. "Daniel, I don't think I can keep pretending everything's okay anymore." Tessa frowned. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I think you have the wrong number." Silence answered her. She expected an apology, maybe the click of a disconnected call. Instead, the stranger exhaled as though the weight of the entire week had just escaped his lungs. He whispered. "I must have dialed wrong." Tessa glanced toward the phone before looking back out the rain-speckled kitchen window. Streetlights shimmered across wet pavement, while the neighborhood slept beneath the steady Oregon drizzle. She should end the call. She had work. Again tomorrow. The mortgage payment was already 10 days late. Her old sedan needed new brakes. The refrigerator contained little more than eggs, milk, and leftover soup. She didn't have time for conversations with strangers. Yet there was something about the quiet on the other end that stopped her finger from pressing the disconnect button. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anger. It sounded like someone standing alone in a room much too large for one person. "I'm not Daniel," she repeated gently, "but if you just need someone to listen for a minute, I can do that." Another long pause followed. She almost wondered if he'd already hung up. Then he laughed once, quietly, without joy. "You're surprisingly kind to someone who interrupted your night." Tessa smiled faintly, though he couldn't see it. "Maybe because my night wasn't all that exciting to begin with." The stranger let out a slow breath. "I've been trying to convince everyone around me that I'm fine." "Are you?" she asked. "No." The honesty landed between them without drama, without explanation. Simply existed. Tessa leaned back in the creaky kitchen chair and folded one leg beneath herself. Then maybe pretending is making things harder. On the other end of the city, nearly 15 miles away, Callum Vance stood barefoot beside the floor-to-ceiling windows of a glass penthouse overlooking thousands of glowing lights. Awards lined the shelves behind him. Financial newspapers carrying his photograph rested unopened on the marble counter. His phone reflected the skyline in its dark screen. He had meant to call Dr. Daniel Mercer, the therapist who had once helped his younger brother through difficult months before the accident that changed everything. Instead, one wrong digit had connected him to a stranger whose voice sounded warmer than the expensive apartment surrounding him. He didn't understand why he hadn't ended the call. Maybe because she hadn't rushed him. Maybe because she didn't know his last name. Maybe because, for the first time in months, nobody expected him to have answers. "Can I ask you something?" he finally said. "Sure." "Do you ever feel guilty for surviving days that someone else never got to see?" Tessa's fingers tightened around the receiver. The question wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't dramatic. It carried the quiet ache of someone who had been asking himself the same thing every night. She answered carefully. "I think guilt has a way of pretending it's love. But they're not the same thing." Callum closed his eyes. Nobody in his boardroom had ever spoken to him like that. Nobody in the interviews, the meetings, or the endless charity dinners had ever answered without trying to impress him. This woman didn't know who he was. She wasn't trying to gain anything. She was simply listening. Minutes slipped past unnoticed. Rain tapped gently against Tessa's windows while distant traffic whispered beneath Callum's balcony. Neither of them realized nearly 40 minutes had disappeared. Finally, Callum looked toward the digital clock glowing beside the elevator. "I've kept you up far too long." "I've been awake the whole time," Tessa replied with a tired laugh. "Good point." Another silence settled comfortably between them. This one felt different. Lighter. Safer. "Thank you," he said, "for answering." Tessa looked at the faded cream-colored telephone resting on the table. It had belonged to her mother for over 20 years, and she had never found the heart to replace it. "You're welcome," she answered. "I hope tomorrow feels a little easier." Before hanging up, Callum hesitated one last time. Would it be completely unreasonable? His voice almost disappeared. "If I accidentally called this wrong number again tomorrow night?" Tessa slept barely 4 hours before the shrill alarm on her aging phone pulled her back into reality. Morning sunlight filtered through thin curtains, revealing the same modest kitchen, the same unpaid bills, and the same cream-colored telephone resting quietly on the corner of the table as if nothing unusual had happened the night before. She poured herself a cup of coffee that tasted far weaker than she preferred and glanced at the phone again. What kind of person accidentally poured his heart out to a complete stranger? And why had his voice lingered in her thoughts all morning? She shook the questions away, grabbed her faded denim jacket, and headed toward the customer support center where another day of scripted conversations waited for her. 8 hours disappeared beneath fluorescent lights, endless ringing headsets, and customers frustrated over insurance claims that Tessa had no authority to approve. She apologized hundreds of times for decisions she had never made. She smiled because company policy required warmth, even when no one could see her face. During lunch, she quietly counted the cash in her wallet. $43. Payday was still 5 days away. The mortgage notice folded inside her purse reminded her that another missed payment would trigger another warning letter from the bank. She folded the paper smaller before slipping it back inside. Across the city, Callum Vance walked through the polished headquarters of Vance Meridian surrounded by executives discussing acquisition reports, quarterly projections, and investor meetings worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Screens displayed financial charts while assistants hurried between conference rooms carrying tablets and folders. Callum answered every question with his usual confidence, but his attention drifted every few minutes toward the phone lying beside his notebook. More than once he almost admitted he had spent 40 minutes talking with a stranger the previous night, but the thought sounded ridiculous even inside his own head. By late afternoon his chief operating officer noticed his distraction. "Everything all right?" she asked as they stepped out of a meeting. Callum nodded automatically. Just did not sleep much. It was technically true. He had slept for nearly 3 hours, more than he had managed in weeks, yet he could not explain why the rest had felt different. That evening Tessa arrived home carrying a small grocery bag with soup, bread, and fresh apples purchased because they were on sale. She changed into an oversized gray sweater, heated the soup, and settled into the same kitchen chair where the previous conversation had begun. She laughed quietly at herself. What was she doing? Waiting for a stranger to call? That was absurd. She reached for a book instead, determined to spend the evening reading. At exactly 11:47 p.m., the cream-colored telephone rang. Once, twice, 3 times. Tessa stared at it before finally answering with a smile she had not expected to feel. "Good evening." A familiar voice answered almost immediately. "I was hoping this was still the wrong number." She leaned back in her chair. "I suppose that depends. Are you looking for Daniel tonight?" A soft laugh traveled through the line, warmer than the night before. "Not anymore." For reasons neither of them understood, the awkwardness disappeared almost instantly. They spoke as though they had simply paused yesterday's conversation instead of beginning a new one. "Did today treat you any better?" Tessa asked. "It was productive," Callum replied carefully. "That sounds like a business answer." "Maybe because I spend too much time at work." "What kind of work keeps someone awake at midnight?" He hesitated only briefly. "Technology." Tessa smiled. "That explains absolutely nothing. I warned you I was not very interesting. I think people who say they are not interesting usually have the longest stories." Callum looked out across the city lights shimmering beyond his windows. She had no idea she was speaking to someone whose company employed thousands of people across the country. Somehow that ignorance felt comforting instead of insulting. "What about you?" he asked. "What do you do?" Tessa stirred the last spoonful of soup without taking another bite. "Customer support. That must require a lot of patience." She laughed softly. "Some days it requires miracles. You sound like someone who likes helping people." Tessa looked toward an old framed photograph sitting beside the telephone. It showed her mother standing on the same front porch years earlier, smiling with wind-blown hair and flour still dusted across her apron. "My mother believed everyone deserved to feel heard at least once every day," she said quietly. She used to leave little notes beside this telephone that said, "Do not let a lonely person listen to too many unanswered rings." Callum remained silent for several seconds. When he finally spoke, his voice had become noticeably softer. "She sounds like someone I wish I had met." Tessa smiled gently. "I think she would have liked you." Callum lowered his eyes, surprised by how much those simple words affected him. Nobody had spoken to him with such effortless sincerity in a very long time. As the conversation drifted toward midnight, he realized something that would have sounded impossible only 24 hours earlier. He was no longer calling because he had dialed the wrong number. He was calling because somewhere across Portland, a woman with an old cream-colored telephone had become the only person who made the silence disappear. 12 nights passed before either of them realized they had quietly become part of each other's routine. At exactly 11:47 every evening, no matter how chaotic the day had been, the old cream-colored telephone would ring 3 times, and Tessa would smile before lifting the receiver. She stopped wondering whether he would call. Somehow she simply knew he would. Callum noticed the change too. His calendar remained packed with investors, interviews, and strategy meetings, but every evening his attention drifted toward the clock. The board believed he had suddenly become more focused because his temper had softened, and he no longer snapped at minor mistakes. Nobody guessed that the difference began with 45 minutes spent talking to a woman whose face he had never seen. One rainy Thursday evening Tessa answered on the first ring. "You are early," she teased. "I finished work sooner than expected," Callum replied. "Either that or you were waiting beside the telephone." Tessa laughed. "I was making tea." "I will pretend to believe that." The conversation felt effortless now, almost as though they had known each other for years instead of less than 2 weeks. They spoke about ordinary things that somehow became extraordinary simply because the other person listened. Tessa described the elderly customer, who had spent 10 minutes explaining his vegetable garden, before asking about his insurance policy. Callum admitted he had eaten vending machine pretzels for dinner, because he forgot to leave his office before every restaurant had closed. "That is the saddest billionaire, businessman story I have ever heard," Tessa joked before catching herself. "Businessman?" Callum asked with a grin she could not see. "You sound like someone who works too much." "Fair observation. You should hire someone to remind you to eat." "Maybe I just found someone." Tessa rolled her eyes even though he could not possibly know. "Nice try." Their laughter lingered for several seconds before fading into a comfortable silence. Unlike awkward silence, this one never demanded to be filled. It simply existed, peaceful and familiar. After another moment Tessa spoke more seriously. "Maybe we should make a few rules." "Rules? For these conversations?" Callum leaned against the cool glass overlooking Portland's skyline. "I am listening." "First, we do not ask each other for last names." "Agreed." "Second, no searching online." "That seems reasonable." "Third." She hesitated. "No meeting in person." The words surprised even her. She had not planned to say them until they left her mouth. Callum frowned slightly. "Why?" Tessa looked around her modest kitchen. Peeling paint near the windowsill. A refrigerator held together with magnets collected by her mother over 20 years. Shoes drying beside the back door because another rainy walk home had soaked them. "Because people are usually different once real life gets involved," she answered honestly. "Sometimes conversations are safer before expectations show up." Callum understood far more than she realized. If she ever discovered his name, she would immediately find photographs, magazine covers, interviews, estimates of his fortune, and endless opinions written by strangers. Everything simple between them would instantly become complicated. I accept all 3 rules, he said quietly. Good. Can I add one? Of course. We use shorter names. Tessa smiled. Meaning? You can call me Cal. She repeated it once. Cal. Somehow it suited the version of him she knew. Then I guess I am Tess. Nice to meet you, Tess. Nice to meet you too, Cal. A warm silence followed before Tessa absent-mindedly tapped her fingertips against the side of the old telephone. Top, top, top. The rhythm echoed softly through the receiver. What was that? Callum asked. She looked at her fingers, surprised she had done it without thinking. My mother used to knock 3 times on the phone before hanging up whenever someone she loved lived far away. Why? She always said it meant, I am still here. Callum closed his eyes. The simple explanation settled somewhere deep inside him. I like that, he whispered. Then maybe you should borrow it. The next evening, before either of them said goodbye, Callum gently tapped the side of his own phone 3 times. Top, top, top. Tessa smiled before answering with the same rhythm. Neither of them realized they had just created a language that belonged only to the 2 of them. As the days continued, neither Cal nor Tess cared about appearances, job titles, or social status. One lived in a quiet house filled with memories. The other lived in a luxurious penthouse filled with expensive silence. Yet every night, when one voice answered and the other replied, those 2 completely different worlds somehow met exactly halfway. Tessa began believing that life had settled into a rhythm she could trust. The mornings were still rushed, the bills still arrived with uncomfortable regularity, and the old house still creaked every time the wind rolled in from the river, but every evening ended with a conversation that somehow made the difficult parts of the day feel lighter. She never admitted it aloud, yet she found herself saving little stories for Cal instead of telling them to herself. A funny customer. A stray golden retriever that followed her for 3 blocks before its owner caught up. A bakery downtown that filled the entire street with the smell of fresh cinnamon every morning. Callum did the same without realizing it. During meetings he would catch himself thinking, Tess will laugh when she hears this. His assistant noticed him smiling at his phone more than once, but he simply blamed a successful quarter. One Friday afternoon an unexpected email changed Tessa's schedule. Her supervisor informed her that several employees would be assisting at a customer appreciation event hosted inside the Halston Grand Hotel downtown. It was not glamorous work. They would simply answer questions, direct guests, and help visitors register for promotional services. Overtime pay, however, meant another step toward keeping her mother's house, so she accepted immediately. The following evening she arrived wearing her cleanest navy blue blouse and a simple black skirt. The elegant marble lobby felt like another world. Crystal chandeliers reflected across polished floors while guests in tailored suits drifted through the entrance carrying conversations that sounded effortless and expensive. Tessa quietly reminded herself that she was there to work, not to admire the architecture. At nearly the same moment, several floors above the lobby, Callum stood inside a private conference suite finishing a difficult negotiation that had stretched nearly 6 hours longer than expected. His temples throbbed from exhaustion. He had skipped lunch again, answered more than 70 emails, and politely declined another interview. As the meeting finally ended, he stepped into a private elevator hoping to reach the parking garage unnoticed. The doors slid shut. The elevator descended 2 floors before stopping unexpectedly with a soft mechanical shutter. The lights flickered once. Then everything became still. Callum inhaled slowly, but his chest tightened anyway. The enclosed silence felt suddenly much smaller than the spacious penthouse he returned to each night. Memories he usually kept carefully locked away pressed against the edges of his thoughts. He reached for the emergency button, but before he could press it, the elevator doors opened halfway and stopped again. Hotel staff hurried toward the opening while reassuring everyone inside that maintenance was already responding. Tessa happened to be walking past with a stack of registration folders when she noticed one passenger standing perfectly still, while everyone else stepped calmly into the hallway. The man remained inside the elevator, his breathing becoming noticeably uneven. She handed the folders to another employee without hesitation and approached the doorway. "Sir," she said gently, careful not to crowd him, "you are safe." They have already fixed the door enough for you to step out whenever you are ready. He nodded without moving. Tessa recognized the expression immediately. She had heard countless versions of that silence during late-night customer calls. Sometimes people did not need instructions. They simply needed someone willing to remain beside them. "Do not worry about anyone watching," she continued quietly. "Just look at me for a second." Callum lifted his eyes. He noticed kind hazel eyes, a calm smile, and a woman who seemed completely uninterested in judging him. "Take one slow breath with me," she said. "That is all." He followed. One breath became two. The pressure in his chest eased little by little. Tessa rested one hand lightly against the metal railing beside the doorway and absent-mindedly tapped it 3 gentle times. Top, top, top. The sound echoed softly through the elevator. Something about that rhythm felt strangely familiar, though Callum could not immediately place why. By the time he stepped into the hallway, his breathing had steadied. "Thank you," he said sincerely. "You helped more than you probably realize." Tessa smiled. Everyone needs someone calm once in a while. Before he could ask her name, another hotel employee approached to escort him toward a private exit. At the same moment, Tessa's supervisor called her from across the lobby, asking for assistance with arriving guests. They exchanged one final polite smile before walking in opposite directions. Neither of them looked back. Late that night, as always, the cream-colored telephone rang exactly 3 times. Tessa answered with an easy smile. "Good evening, Cal." His voice sounded thoughtful. "Tess, something unusual happened today." She settled into her chair. "Tell me about it." He looked across the city lights beyond his apartment windows and spoke slowly. "I met a woman I will probably never see again. She helped me through a difficult moment, and before she walked away, she tapped her fingers 3 times on a metal railing." Tessa laughed softly without giving it another thought. Maybe she had a habit she learned from someone she loved. Callum smiled to himself. Maybe she did. Neither of them realized that only a few hours earlier they had been standing less than 3 feet apart, separated not by distance, but by a promise they had made to remain strangers. The conversation after the hotel lingered in both of their minds far longer than either of them admitted. Tessa thought only briefly about the quiet businessman who had looked overwhelmed inside the elevator before deciding that he was probably already back to his busy life. Callum, however, found himself replaying every detail of the encounter. The calm voice, the patient smile, the 3 gentle taps against the railing. It all felt strangely familiar, yet every time he tried to connect the memory to something else, the answer slipped away. Life continued moving forward, but their nightly conversations gradually became less like conversations between strangers and more like the ending of every single day. Tessa no longer waited until she finished washing dishes before answering the telephone. Sometimes she carried the receiver into the living room while folding laundry. Other nights she sat on the front porch wrapped in a blanket, listening to crickets while Cal described another exhausting day that always sounded far more complicated than he allowed himself to admit. One evening he confessed that he had spent nearly 12 straight hours solving problems created by people who rarely accepted responsibility for their own mistakes. "You make your job sound impossible," Tessa said. "Some days it feels that way. Then why keep doing it?" There was a long pause before he answered. "Because thousands of people depend on the decisions I make, even if they never know my name." Tessa smiled softly. "That sounds like a heavier responsibility than you usually admit." Callum looked toward the framed photograph of his younger brother resting on a bookshelf across the penthouse. "Maybe I am still trying to prove that I deserve it." She did not press him for details. She had learned that people often revealed their deepest truths only after realizing they would never be forced to explain them. Instead, she quietly changed the subject. "Can I tell you something embarrassing?" "Always. When I was 10 years old, I tried to bake my mother a birthday cake. Without reading the recipe, I forgot the sugar." Callum laughed so unexpectedly that he had to lower the phone from his ear for a moment. "Please tell me she still ate it. Every bite. Even without sugar?" She said love was sweet enough. The laughter faded into another comfortable silence. "I miss her every day," Tessa admitted quietly. "Sometimes I still catch myself reaching for the telephone because I want to ask her what to cook for dinner." What do you think she would say? Tessa looked toward the old cream-colored telephone sitting beside her. She would probably tell me that soup solves more problems than people realize. Callum smiled to himself. I think I would have liked your mother very much. She would have liked you too. The words settled gently over him again, just as they had before. Nobody in his world complimented his character anymore. They praised his company, his investments, his leadership, or his wealth. Tess somehow managed to make him feel seen without ever asking who he really was. A few nights later, Callum surprised himself by asking a question he had been avoiding. Have you ever wondered what I look like? Tessa smiled toward the ceiling. Not really. He blinked. Seriously. I have imagined about 20 different versions of you. Which one is winning? She laughed. Tonight? Maybe someone who forgets to eat lunch, owns too many blue shirts, and probably needs a better coffee maker. He looked down at the navy blue dress shirt he had worn nearly every Wednesday for months and could not help laughing. That is oddly specific. Was I close? Close enough to make me a little uncomfortable. Good, she teased. Your turn. Have you wondered what I think you look like? Not unless the answer is flattering. I think you smile before you even realize you are smiling. Tessa felt unexpectedly quiet. No one had ever described her that way. You cannot know that. Maybe not, Callum answered. But I think kindness leaves clues. She stared through the window at the porch light glowing softly against the damp grass. For reasons she could not explain, her heart suddenly felt much lighter and much more frightened at the same time. The 3 rules they had created were supposed to protect them. No last names. No searching. No meeting. Yet none of those rules could prevent feelings from quietly finding their way into the spaces between midnight conversations. Before hanging up that evening, neither of them said goodnight immediately. Instead there was another long silence, one that neither wanted to end. Finally Callum spoke so softly that she almost missed the words. Tess. Yes. If we had met before that first phone call, do you think we still would have become friends? Tessa closed her eyes and smiled to herself. I do not know about friends. She paused just long enough to make his heart race. But I think I would have wanted to know you. For the first time since his brother's passing, Callum realized he was looking forward to tomorrow not because of another business opportunity, another meeting or another achievement, but because somewhere across the city a woman with an old cream-colored telephone had quietly become the best part of every single day. 3 days later Tessa's supervisor walked across the customer support floor holding a clipboard and calling out names for another temporary assignment. Whitmore, I need you downtown tomorrow evening. Vance Meridian is hosting a charity gala at the Halston Grand Hotel. They requested additional guest support. Tessa looked up from her computer. The same hotel? Exactly. Good overtime pay. Wear business attire. She nodded without much thought. The extra hours would cover another portion of her overdue mortgage, and right now that mattered far more than elegant ballrooms or important guests. Across town, Callum stood before a floor-to-ceiling display screen reviewing the final details of the event. The gala would introduce the Vance Meridian Foundation's new initiative supporting mental health services throughout Oregon. Investors, journalists, city officials, and nonprofit leaders had all confirmed their attendance. His communications director adjusted a few notes before looking at him. Your keynote speech begins at 8:15. After that, interviews, photographs, then the donor reception. Callum barely heard the schedule. Instead, he found himself thinking about the conversation he hoped to have later that evening. He wanted to tell Tess something he had never admitted aloud. He wanted to explain why the wrong number had mattered so much. Yet every time he imagined revealing his real name, he pictured the silence that would probably follow. The gala arrived beneath a clear autumn sky. Tessa entered through the employee entrance wearing a simple navy dress she had borrowed from a coworker. It fit well enough, though she kept smoothing the sleeves as she walked through the enormous ballroom. Crystal chandeliers sparkled above perfectly arranged tables covered with white linen. A string quartet rehearsed softly near the stage while servers carried polished trays through the room. Everything looked beautiful, but none of it felt like her world. She focused on greeting guests, answering directions, and helping elderly attendees find their assigned tables. Every now and then she caught glimpses of photographers gathering near the front of the ballroom. Apparently someone important was about to arrive. At precisely 8:15 the lights dimmed. Conversations faded into silence as the master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us this evening. Please welcome the founder and chief executive officer of Vance Meridian, whose leadership has transformed technology and whose new foundation hopes to transform lives. Mr. Callum Vance. The room erupted into applause. Tessa turned casually toward the stage. Then she froze. A tall man in a perfectly tailored dark suit walked confidently beneath the spotlight. She recognized the calm posture first, then the thoughtful expression, then the voice. "Good evening," he began. "Thank you for believing that success means very little unless it improves someone else's tomorrow." The words were simple, but Tessa barely heard them. Her heartbeat drowned out everything else. Cal. Her Cal. The man who claimed he simply worked in technology. The man who forgot to eat lunch. The man who laughed about sugarless birthday cakes. The man who called every night from what she had imagined was a small apartment somewhere across the city. He was not an ordinary businessman. He was one of the most recognizable executives in the country. Suddenly every missing detail made sense. The careful answers. The refusal to share a last name. The responsibility that affected thousands of people. Even the expensive hotel elevator where she had unknowingly helped him. Tessa felt as though the floor beneath her had quietly shifted. On stage, Callum continued speaking about grief, hope, and the importance of listening before trying to solve someone's pain. As his eyes scanned the audience, they stopped abruptly. Near the back of the ballroom stood a woman in a simple navy dress. Hazel eyes. Gentle smile now replaced by stunned silence. Tess. For one impossible second the crowded ballroom disappeared around him. The woman from the elevator. The woman from every midnight conversation. The woman who had become the safest place in his life. They had been the same person all along. His speech continued because years of public appearances had trained him never to lose composure, but every sentence suddenly carried a different meaning. When the applause finally ended, Callum stepped away from reporters waiting near the stage. "Excuse me," he said politely before moving quickly through the crowd. Tessa had already turned toward the hallway outside the ballroom. She needed air. She needed quiet. Most of all, she needed to understand how the man who had promised honesty within their strange little world had managed to hide an entire life. Tess. She stopped instantly. No one else in the building knew that name. Slowly she turned around. Callum stood only a few feet away. No cameras between them now, no audience, no applause. Just silence. She looked into the same eyes she had imagined during countless late-night conversations. He looked at the woman whose voice had carried him through his darkest nights. Neither of them spoke for several long seconds. Finally Tessa asked the only question that mattered. "How long were you planning to keep pretending you were just Cal?" Callum did not answer immediately. The confidence that had carried him through board meetings, investor negotiations, and interviews disappeared beneath the weight of one simple question. He looked at Tessa, searching for the right words, but every explanation sounded smaller than the truth. "I never wanted to lie to you," he said quietly. Tessa folded her arms, not out of anger alone, but to steady herself. "Then why did you?" "Because the first night you answered the phone, you did not know my last name. You did not know what I owned, what I was worth, or what people expected from me. You only heard another human being." She lowered her eyes for a moment before looking back at him. "You still made a choice every single day to let me believe you were just another man trying to get through life. I was trying to be. No, Callum." His real name felt unfamiliar on her lips. "You were deciding how much of yourself I deserved to know." Her words landed harder than any public criticism he had ever received. "I told you I worked in technology. That is like saying Mount Hood is just a hill." Despite everything, the brief flash of humor almost made him smile, but the hurt in her eyes stopped him. "You had information," she continued. "You knew who you were. You knew your world. You knew what would happen if I ever found out. I had none of those choices." Around them, elegant guests continued laughing and talking only a few yards away, completely unaware that two lives were quietly breaking apart in the hallway. "Tess, I wanted to tell you." "When?" she asked. "Next week? Next month? Or after I accidentally found another magazine with your face on the cover. Callum ran a hand through his hair. Every time I tried, I became afraid. Afraid of what? Losing the only place where nobody looked at my money before looking at me. Tessa's expression softened for the briefest moment because she believed him. That was what made everything hurt even more. Do you know what is unfair? She asked. You were afraid I would treat you differently after learning the truth. I never even had the opportunity to decide whether that was true. Neither of them noticed a photographer stepping into the hallway searching for candid moments from the gala. Before either could move away, a camera flashed. Once, then again. Callum instinctively stepped toward Tessa, but she took one step back instead. Please do not. The photographer quietly disappeared, satisfied with the unexpected images. Neither of them realized those photographs would appear online before sunrise. I need to go, Tessa whispered. Please let me explain everything. You already did. She looked at him with tired eyes that somehow carried disappointment more than anger. You thought protecting yourself was more important than trusting me. Without waiting for another answer, she walked away. Callum remained standing in the hallway long after she disappeared through the employee entrance. For the first time in years, success felt completely meaningless. The next morning, Portland woke to headlines about the charity gala. Most articles focused on the foundation's announcement, but several entertainment websites chose a different story. Photographs of Callum following an unknown woman through the ballroom hallway spread across social media with endless speculation. Who was the mystery woman? Was she secretly dating the billionaire chief executive officer? Had they met before the gala? By 8:30 that morning, Tessa's supervisor called her into a small office. The older woman placed a printed article on the desk between them. Can you explain this? Tessa looked at the photographs without saying anything. Nothing inappropriate happened, she answered honestly. That is not really the problem, her supervisor replied with an uncomfortable sigh. Several clients have already called asking questions. They think one of our employees used a company assignment to pursue a high-profile guest. That is not what happened. I believe you. The supervisor paused before continuing. Unfortunately, perception matters. Human Resources has decided to place you on unpaid leave while they review the situation. The words settled heavily inside the room. Tessa nodded slowly. She understood there was no point arguing. She quietly gathered her purse, thanked the supervisor for her honesty, and walked out carrying a cardboard box with a few personal items from her desk. That evening, the cream-colored telephone sat silently on the kitchen table. At exactly 11:47 it rang. Once, twice, 3 times. Tessa stared at it without moving. The ringing stopped. A minute later it began again. Once, twice, 3 times. Tears filled her eyes, but she still did not answer. Across the city, Callum lowered his phone after the second unanswered call. He had faced hostile shareholders, impossible negotiations, and billion-dollar risks without feeling helpless. Yet the silence coming from one modest house hurt more than all of them combined. Back inside her kitchen, Tessa slowly reached for the old cream-colored telephone after the ringing had already stopped. She gently rested her hand on it, then quietly unplugged the cord from the wall. The familiar click echoed through the room. For the first time since her mother passed away, the old telephone no longer carried the possibility of another voice. It simply became another memory waiting in silence. The silence lasted 8 days. 8 evenings without the familiar ringing at 11:47. 8 mornings where Tessa automatically glanced toward the cream-colored telephone before remembering that it was no longer connected to the wall. The quiet should have brought relief, yet somehow it only made the little house feel emptier than it had since her mother passed away. She filled the hours by searching for work, sending applications to customer service departments, nonprofit organizations, and small local businesses. Most never replied. The few interviews she managed to schedule ended politely after employers searched her name and found photographs from the gala. She refused to blame Callum for every disappointment, but she could not deny that her life had changed because of a truth she had never been allowed to know. Across the city, Callum stopped pretending he could solve every problem with influence or money. His legal team offered to challenge Tessa's suspension. His public relations director suggested issuing a statement explaining that she had done nothing inappropriate. His board recommended ignoring the story entirely until another headline replaced it. For the first time since becoming chief executive officer, Callum rejected every carefully crafted strategy. "No," he said during a board meeting. "This situation exists because I made a personal decision that affected another person's life. I will take responsibility myself." 2 days later, journalists gathered inside Vance Meridian headquarters, expecting another business announcement. Instead, Callum stepped behind the podium alone without prepared remarks or polished marketing slides. Cameras flashed as reporters settled into silence. "Before discussing our foundation," he began, "I need to correct something much more important." The room immediately grew still. Recently, a private photograph led to public speculation involving a woman who never asked to become part of a news story. She did nothing wrong. She attended our event because she was working. Every misunderstanding that followed began with choices I made, not choices she made. Reporters exchanged surprised glances. Callum continued without hesitation. "Several months ago, I accidentally called the wrong telephone number. The woman who answered listened to a stranger without asking for anything in return. I continued calling because she reminded me that titles and wealth mean very little if someone no longer remembers how to be honest. The mistake was not that we spoke. The mistake was believing I could protect something meaningful by hiding the truth." Every word reached television stations across Oregon before lunchtime. Callum did not mention Tessa's name. He did not describe where she lived or reveal anything personal about her. He protected her privacy while accepting full responsibility for his own actions. After the press conference ended, he quietly submitted paperwork transferring day-to-day leadership of the Mental Health Foundation to an independent board rather than keeping public attention centered on himself. "If this foundation is truly about helping people," he told his directors, "then it cannot depend upon one man's reputation." That same afternoon, an envelope arrived in Tessa's mailbox with no return address, except a small embossed V. She hesitated before opening it. Inside, she found no expensive jewelry, no check, and no invitation to a luxurious dinner. There was only a small digital voice recorder and a handwritten note. The note simply read, "Please listen only if you want to." After several quiet minutes, she pressed the play button. Callum's familiar voice filled the kitchen. "Hello, Tess. If you are hearing this, it means I finally stopped trying to fix everything with solutions and started trying to understand the damage I caused. I spent most of my life believing leadership meant protecting people from difficult truths. You showed me that real trust begins where control ends. I am not asking you to forgive me today. I only want you to know that meeting you changed the way I measure success. You once told me your mother believed nobody should hear too many unanswered rings. Think she was right. Thank you for answering mine." The recording ended. Tessa sat quietly for a long time before placing the recorder beside the old cream-colored telephone. Tears gathered in her eyes, not because the pain had disappeared, but because for the first time she believed his apology had not been written by lawyers or public relations experts. It belonged entirely to the man she had once known only as Cal. The following week, another unexpected letter arrived, this time from the company where she had been placed on unpaid leave. After an internal review and growing public support following Callum's statement, the company formally acknowledged that she had violated no policy and offered to reinstate her position immediately. Tessa read the letter twice before folding it closed. Then she quietly placed it beside the recorder without signing the acceptance form. Somewhere during the difficult weeks, she had realized she no longer wanted to spend her life reading scripted apologies through a headset. Instead, she found herself sketching ideas for a small overnight listening service where volunteers could answer lonely callers who simply needed someone willing to stay on the line. For the first time in years, the future she imagined belonged completely to her. 6 months later, the small building on the corner of Alder Street looked nothing like the abandoned office it had once been. Fresh paint covered the walls. Warm lamps glowed through wide front windows. A simple wooden sign above the entrance read, "Still here Nightline." Beneath the name, in smaller letters, another sentence welcomed every visitor. "Because everyone deserves to be heard." Tessa unlocked the front door just before sunset and stepped inside with the same cream-colored telephone her mother had treasured for decades. It no longer served as the main phone line. Instead, it rested inside a glass display near the entrance with a small brass plaque beneath it that read, One answered call can change 2 lives. Volunteers gradually filled the room, preparing coffee, testing headsets, and reviewing call schedules. Some were retired teachers. Others were college students, nurses, veterans, or neighbors who simply believed that listening could sometimes be the greatest gift a stranger received all day. Tessa smiled as she watched them laugh together. For the first time in years, she had built something that reflected exactly who she wanted to become. She had politely declined returning to her old customer support position. Instead, she used her savings, a small community grant, and donations from local supporters to create the overnight listening service she once imagined only in quiet moments. She accepted financial contributions from many people, but only after insisting that every donation remain anonymous. One contributor had quietly respected that request without asking for recognition. As evening settled across Portland, the first calls began arriving. Some lasted only a few minutes. Others stretched much longer. A widower who could not sleep. A college student anxious about final exams. A truck driver crossing state lines who simply wanted another voice during a lonely highway shift. Every conversation reminded Tessa why she had chosen this path. Shortly before closing, the volunteers finished their final reports and slowly headed home. Tessa stayed behind to organize tomorrow's schedule. The office grew quiet until only the gentle ticking of a wall clock remained. Then, at exactly 11:47 p.m., the old cream-colored telephone inside the display case rang. Once, twice, 3 times. Tessa stood perfectly still. The telephone had not been connected to the main network. Only one person knew the private number she had quietly reactivated that morning as a tribute to her mother. She unlocked the display, lifted the familiar receiver, and smiled before speaking. "Still here, Nightline. How may I help you?" A warm voice answered with a nervous laugh she had not heard in months. "I am looking for someone who once answered the wrong call." Tessa closed her eyes. "You finally found the right number. May I see you?" Callum asked gently. "Only if you are ready." She looked toward the front window. A tall man stood beneath the porch light wearing a simple charcoal coat instead of an expensive tailored suit. There were no security guards. No photographers. No waiting limousine. Just Callum, holding a small paper bag in one hand and looking far more nervous than any billionaire had a right to look. Tessa opened the front door. For several seconds neither of them moved. They simply smiled, allowing the silence to say everything that words could not. "You came," she whispered. "I should have come sooner." He held up the paper bag. "I brought cinnamon rolls from that bakery you told me about. They were almost sold out." Tessa laughed, the sound lighter than it had been in a very long time. "You remembered." "I remember everything you ever told me." They walked slowly inside the office. Callum stopped in front of the glass display holding the old cream-colored telephone. "Your mother was right," he said quietly. "One answered ring really can change a life." 2 lives, Tessa corrected with a smile. He nodded. 2 lives. From his coat pocket he removed a small velvet box and placed it gently on the table between them without opening it. "I am not asking you to forget what happened," he said. "I am asking whether we can build something honest from this moment forward. No hidden names. No half-truths. No pretending to be anyone except ourselves." Tessa looked at him for a long moment before reaching toward the glass display. She gently tapped the old telephone 3 times. "Top, top, top." Callum smiled immediately and answered with the same familiar rhythm against the tabletop. "Top, top, top." The language they had created as strangers had somehow survived everything that nearly tore them apart. Tears filled Tessa's eyes as she opened the velvet box. Inside rested a simple platinum ring beside a folded piece of paper. She unfolded it carefully. Written in Callum's handwriting were the words, "The best thing I ever found was never the right number. It was the right person." She looked back at him and slipped her hand into his. "Yes," she whispered. 1 year later, friends, neighbors, volunteers, and co-workers gathered in the small garden behind the Still Here Nightline for a quiet wedding filled with laughter instead of luxury. There were no grand speeches, no celebrity guests, and no headlines waiting outside the gate. Only 2 people who had discovered that kindness could travel farther than wealth. Honesty could heal what fear had damaged. And sometimes the smallest mistake could become the beginning of the greatest blessing either heart had ever known. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who believes in true love, and subscribe to Chosen by Love for more unforgettable billionaire romance stories filled with hope, kindness, second chances, and emotional twists. Your support helps us bring more heartfelt stories to life. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next story.